On a freezing February morning in 1934, a mansion sat above the Missouri hills like a European castle misplaced in the American Midwest. Inside that house, behind thick walls built to impress and protect, a man was losing a battle he could not buy his way out of. His body had been failing for months: heart disease, gout, dropsy, pain that turned every hour into a negotiation. He had survived Prohibition. He had carried a brewing empire through the one era that should have killed it. He had watched his family name become one of the most powerful brands in the country. And yet, in that bedroom, none of it mattered. Just after 8 in the morning, his chauffeur walked in the way he always did and turned on the radio, hoping music might cut through the silence. A second later, a single gunshot snapped through the room. It was not the sound of celebration. It was the sound of surrender. August Anheuser-Busch Sr., president of the largest brewing company in America, had ended his own life with a pearl-handled revolver. Beside him sat a short note, not a long explanation, not a dramatic confession, just a farewell to the people he still loved. "Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children." 2 words underlined, as if he wanted to make sure they were the last thing the world remembered about him. Precious, adorable. This was not the kind of ending people associate with dynasties. The world likes its rich families to be untouchable, to glide through history in polished shoes and perfect photographs, to never break in ways ordinary people recognize. But that gunshot inside that bedroom is the first clue to what Grant's Farm really is. Because the Busch family estate was never just a mansion. It was an altar to ambition, a fortress built on a piece of land already soaked in American myth, and a place where triumph and tragedy kept taking turns. The property carried a name that did not belong to the Busch family at all: Grant's Farm, a name tied to a man who became President of the United States, but who first lived on that land not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a struggling farmer fighting stubborn soil and harder luck. It was a place where the American dream looked small and desperate before it ever looked grand. And that is the strange truth about this mansion. It sits at the intersection of 2 American stories that seem incompatible. One is a story of failure, bankruptcy, and humiliation. The other is a story of immigrant success, so massive it reshaped the country. And when those stories collided, they did not cancel each other out. They stacked on top of each other like layers in a wall, and the result was a mansion that could never fully escape the weight of what came before. To understand why death echoed through that house in 1934, you have to go back farther than the mansion. You have to go back to where the Busch family story actually begins, across the Atlantic, in the Old World, in a small German village called Kastel, in a family that understood trade, supply, and discipline long before America ever learned their name. In the summer of 1839, a boy was born into that world, Adolphus Busch, one of 22 children, raised under a father who made sure his sons were educated and ambitious. Adolphus grew up surrounded by the tools of business, and he learned early what many people never learn at all. If you want power, you do not wait for it to find you. You move toward it first. At 18 years old, in 1857, Adolphus did what millions would eventually do, but few would do with such timing. He left Germany, boarded a ship, and headed for the United States. He arrived in New Orleans and traveled up the Mississippi to St. Louis, a city already filling with German immigrants and the restless energy of expansion. He came with little money and no deep connections, but he came with a mind trained to recognize opportunity and a hunger that made poverty feel temporary. Those early years were not glamorous. Adolphus worked as a clerk on the riverfront, watching cargo move, watching money move, learning the real mechanics of American commerce. He saved what he could. And when his father died and he received a small inheritance, he did not waste it. He invested it. He partnered with another German immigrant and started a business selling brewing supplies, hops, malt, equipment, the unromantic backbone of beer. It was a smart angle because St. Louis was full of small breweries serving the German population, and every brewery needed supplies even if they struggled. Adolphus was not just selling ingredients. He was building relationships with the people who controlled a thirsty market. That is how he met Eberhard Anheuser, a successful soap manufacturer who had taken over a failing brewery. The beer was not special, not yet. But Eberhard had something Adolphus wanted, and the most powerful deals in American history often begin this way, through family. In 1861, Adolphus married Eberhard's daughter Lily in a double ceremony where his brother married Lily's sister. It looked like romance. It was also strategy. Almost immediately, the Civil War erupted, and Adolphus enlisted in the Union Army, serving with a soldier's discipline that would shape him long after the war ended. When the war was over, he returned to St. Louis with new confidence, new focus, and a clearer sense of what it would take to stop being an immigrant and start being an owner. He joined his father-in-law's brewery and began transforming it, not just by improving the beer, but by changing the entire concept of how beer could be sold in America. Most breweries at the time were local creatures. Their product could not travel far without spoiling. They were limited by geography. Adolphus did not accept limits that could be engineered away. He became obsessed with methods that would let beer survive long journeys. He embraced pasteurization, a technique that allowed beer to be stabilized. Then he pushed into refrigerated transport, using ice-cooled railroad cars that could move beer across distance without ruin. It was not just clever. It was a revolution. He was building a national brewery in an era when most people still thought like towns. Then came the brand that would become a crown, Budweiser. In 1876, Adolphus developed a lighter, crisper beer inspired by Bohemian Pilsners, something designed to appeal beyond the heavy styles that dominated the German market. He named it after Budweiser in the Czech lands, tapping into an old-world association with quality, then flipped the symbolism into something aggressively American. Not a beer for kings, but the king of beers. By the time the company became Anheuser-Busch, and by the time Adolphus rose to president after Eberhard's death, the machine was already moving fast. By 1901, the brewery had surpassed competitors and became the largest in the United States, selling over 1 million barrels a year. Adolphus Busch was no longer a young immigrant on a riverfront. He was one of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in America. He lived like it, too. Mansions in St. Louis, in California, in New York, travel that looked more like royalty than commerce, generosity that built museums and funded relief and impressed the public. He maintained ties to Germany, even building a villa there named after his wife. He had conquered the American dream so thoroughly that he could afford to decorate it with European elegance. But the thing about men like Adolphus is that they do not just want wealth. They want permanence. They want something that will anchor their name to the land itself, something that outlives products and profits. And that desire would eventually lead the family to a piece of Missouri countryside already haunted by the story of another ambitious man. a man who would become famous for war and politics, but who first learned the most brutal lessons of life not on a battlefield, but on a farm. In the 1840s, long before Budweiser, long before Prohibition, a young officer named Ulysses S. Grant was stationed near St. Louis. He visited a plantation called White Haven, owned by the Dent family. The land was beautiful, sprawling, worked by enslaved laborers, shaped by the brutal economics of the era. Grant fell in love there with Julia Dent, and he asked her to marry him under a tree on that property. Their story, often softened into romance, existed inside a harsher reality. This land was part of a system built on forced labor. Even love stories in America have shadows attached. Grant married Julia and received 80 acres as a gift, a start toward independence. He resigned from the army in the 1850s and tried to become what America told every man he should be: a provider, a landowner, a self-made farmer. So he built a cabin with his own hands and named it Hardscrabble, a name that sounded like a joke and turned out to be a prophecy. Grant struggled. Crops failed. Weather crushed his efforts. He sold firewood in St. Louis to survive, standing in the cold with a future that looked nothing like destiny. Eventually, he moved back toward White Haven, and then the Civil War dragged him back into uniform, this time to become one of the most important Union commanders, and eventually the 18th president. But Hardscrabble remained standing, a rare artifact of a famous man's ordinary suffering. And after Grant's presidency, the story turned darker. He became tangled in a Wall Street scheme, lost everything, and in the desperation to pay debts, he signed away his beloved Missouri property. Grant died in 1885, bankrupt, just days after finishing the memoirs that would save his family financially and burn his name permanently into American legend. The land passed through other hands, and then, in 1903, the southern portion of it was purchased by the Busch family, not as a museum piece, not as a patriotic tribute, but as a private kingdom. It was bought by Adolphus Busch for his eldest son, August Anheuser-Busch Sr. August Sr. had grown up inside the empire. He understood brewing not as an abstract business, but as a craft and a machine. When he received the property, it was meant to be a retreat. Hunting, horses, family gatherings, a place to breathe outside the city. But August Sr. did not just want a retreat. He wanted a statement. He wanted a palace that could compete with the grand estates of Europe and prove that the Busch family belonged not just to industry, but to American aristocracy. So in 1910, construction began. August hired architects and planners who knew how to build for spectacle. The mansion that rose was French Renaissance revival, inspired by the chateau of the Loire Valley, but adapted with a heavier, more restrained sensibility. Red brick instead of pale stone. Less delicate ornament, more strength. A face that projected wealth without looking frivolous, power without looking playful. It was enormous. 3 stories over a full basement, more than 24 rooms, 14 bathrooms, spaces designed not for living, but for hosting, for impressing, for turning private life into a stage. Inside were features chosen like trophies: Tiffany stained glass with hunting scenes, a gun room displaying trophies from around the world, floors that shifted between oak, walnut, and marble, art that celebrated the American West, because even as the family built a European castle, they still wanted America to see them as frontier conquerors too. The mansion cost an astonishing sum for its era, completed in 1913, and it stood as one of the grandest private homes in the Midwest. August Sr. and his wife Alice moved in, and for a moment It looked like the family had reached the perfect balance. Old world elegance, new world wealth, a palace built on presidential land, a dynasty anchored to history. Then, in that same year, the patriarch died. Adolphus Busch passed away in Germany, and his body was returned to St. Louis, where immense crowds lined the streets to mourn him. The funeral was not just grief, it was proof of status, a public recognition that this immigrant had become part of the nation's elite. August Sr. inherited leadership of the company in a period when being German in America was becoming dangerous. World War I triggered a wave of anti-German sentiment. The same heritage that had once been a selling point now became a liability. Then, an even larger threat rose, one that did not care about nationality at all. It cared about morality, politics, and control. Prohibition. When the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, it was supposed to end the brewing business in the United States. For hundreds of breweries, that is exactly what it did. Companies that had existed for generations collapsed in silence. Jobs disappeared. Families lost everything. The industry was supposed to die. August Sr. refused. He forced Anheuser-Busch to evolve into something else long enough to survive. They produced products that could keep factories running: malt syrup, baker's yeast, ice cream, soft drinks, corn products, refrigeration equipment. It was not glamorous. It was not the dream. It was survival strategy, and it worked. The company stayed alive through 13 long years of legal drought, waiting for the day the country would reverse itself. In December 1933, Prohibition was repealed. The brewery was ready. The first legal cases rolled off the line, and it should have been the triumphant climax of August Sr.'s life, the moment where the man who carried the empire through the storm finally got to celebrate the clearing sky. But the human body does not care about business victories. By then, August Sr.'s health was collapsing. His pain was constant, and the family had already absorbed another fear, one that every wealthy dynasty learns sooner or later. Money makes you visible, and visibility attracts predators. In 1930, his 13-year-old grandson had been kidnapped at gunpoint. The boy was held for hours until a ransom secured release. He returned alive, but innocence does not return so easily. For the family, it was proof that their world, no matter how guarded, could be invaded. By early 1934, August Sr. could not bear it anymore. Heart disease and swelling, the slow humiliation of a body turning against itself, and perhaps the exhaustion of carrying an empire through moral warfare. In that mansion, built as a monument to success, he chose control in the only place he could still claim it. He took the revolver and he ended his life. The coroner's jury met at the mansion itself, and the verdict was simple: suicide due to long illness. No scandal, no mystery, just the cold recognition that suffering can crush even the strongest businessman. Thousands of mourners came, senators and brewers, people who understood that they were watching the end of an era. August Sr. left instructions about his burial. He did not want to lie with his parents in the grand mausoleum. He wanted to be placed within sight of Grant's farm, close to the estate he had built. Even in death, he clung to the land as if it could hold him. The mansion fell quiet. His widow moved into a smaller cottage. The big house sat like a locked room filled with echoes, opened only occasionally for gatherings, its halls still carrying the memory of the morning. The gunshots snapped everything in half. And then, slowly, another figure began moving toward the center of the story. A man who had stood at his father's funeral. A man whose personality was almost the opposite of the quiet suffering that ended August Sr.'s life. A man who would bring glamour back to the estate and also drag new storms into its walls. August Anheuser-Busch Jr., known to everyone as Gussie. Gussie was born in 1899, raised inside privilege, but he never behaved like someone trained to be careful. Where his father was methodical, Gussie was bold. He loved attention, he loved action, he loved animals, hunting, fast cars, beautiful women, and most of all, the idea that life was meant to be lived loudly. During Prohibition, while the older generation managed survival, Gussie learned sales. He learned charm. He learned how to turn business into spectacle. And when Prohibition ended, he helped deliver one of the most brilliant marketing moments in American business history. A wagon pulled by 8 Clydesdales delivering beer to the White House, a symbol that the country was stepping out of the dark into something familiar and celebratory. But Gussie did not become president immediately. That role went to his older brother. Gussie waited, watched, and built his influence. He served in World War II, worked at the Pentagon, earned honors, and still managed to remain himself, the man who carried jokes and swagger even into military service. When his brother died in 1945, Gussie finally took the throne. And when he became president, he did not just run the company, he performed it. Anheuser-Busch under Gussie became a kingdom with a flamboyant king. Yet the mansion at Grant's Farm still carried pain. For a time, Gussie did not live in the big house where his father had died. The memories were too heavy, the silence too sharp. It would take a new person to reopen those rooms and fill them with life again. That person appeared not in St. Louis, but in Switzerland. In 1949, Gussie traveled there and walked into a family restaurant in Lucerne. Behind the polite atmosphere, he spotted a young hostess, 22 years old, blonde, radiant, smiling with a warmth that made the room feel softer. Her name was Gertrude, called Trudy, and Gussie, in classic form, made his decision instantly. He was captivated. He stayed. He talked. He ran up a large tab, not because he wanted to show off, but because he wanted time. Before the evening was done, he asked her out. Before that date was done, he proposed. It was impulsive, romantic in the way only powerful men can afford to be. There was just one problem. Gussie was still married, though estranged, but Gussie was patient when patience served desire. He courted Trudy across an ocean, sending letters, gifts, promises. He offered her not just wealth, but a role, lady of an American dynasty. In 1952, after his divorce was finalized, Gussie married Trudy. She was 25, he was 53. The gap did not matter to him. What mattered was that she brought a new energy, and she used it to revive Grant's Farm. Trudy insisted the big house be reopened. The locked rooms were cleaned, restored, decorated. The mansion that had become a shrine to death began to sound like life again. Parties returned, flowers returned, guests returned, and with Trudy, the estate entered its most glamorous era. They hosted celebrations rooted in German tradition, events that connected the family back to their immigrant origins while displaying their American dominance. Staff received bonuses, champagne flowed, harvest festivals rang with folk songs. Grant's Farm became a place where power came to pay respect. Presidents visited, dignitaries, celebrities. The estate began to feel less like a private retreat and more like a royal court. Gussie was not content to keep his kingdom private. He had the instincts of a showman and the ego of a builder. In 1953, he bought the St. Louis Cardinals, saving them from relocation and linking the Busch name to baseball royalty. It was business, yes, but it was also identity. Owning the team meant owning a piece of the city's soul, and it gave him a platform to turn beer marketing into culture. Then he did something that still shapes the estate's story today. In 1954, he opened portions of Grant's Farm to the public for free. The idea came from someone who understood what Gussie understood but rarely admitted. People wanted to see the world behind the gates. They wanted a glimpse of what wealth looked like when it was shaped into landscapes and stables and private animal parks. Gussie listened, and soon thousands of visitors were streaming through, riding trams, feeding animals, marveling at a piece of American history that felt like fantasy. A Bavarian-style courtyard, the Bauernhof, became a centerpiece. Timber-framed architecture that made visitors feel transported, stork statues for luck. The Clydesdales housed in stables like sacred creatures, their presence now inseparable from Budweiser. Exotic animals roaming the property like a private ark. Buffalo beside zebras, camels, kangaroos, deer parks. A landscape that blurred Missouri farmland with something closer to a global menagerie. People fell in love with it. Grant's Farm was no longer just a mansion on a hill. It was an experience, a gift, a public stage for a private dynasty. Under Gussie, Anheuser-Busch grew even larger. Budweiser dominated. The Cardinals won championships, and St. Louis embraced the Busch family like local royalty. For a while, it looked like the family had solved the oldest problem in American wealth: how to be powerful without being hated, how to be rich without being isolated. Gussie opened the gates and invited the public to taste the fantasy, and in return, the public forgave a lot. But the shadows never left. They just waited for their next turn. Tragedy hit Gussie's world in a way wealth cannot soften. His youngest daughter, Christina, born when he was already an older man, became the center of his heart. In 1974, she died in a car accident at 8 years old. The loss split him. The man who had always seemed too large to break suddenly became fragile. He sank into depression. He began drinking harder. His behavior grew erratic. People around him began to worry, not just about his grief, but about what grief was doing to the empire. Then Trudy asked for divorce in 1978. After decades, she could not endure the storm that grief and alcohol had made. The marriage that revived Grant's Farm ended, and the mansion that once rang with glamour began to feel like a place where loss piled up faster than anyone could remove it. And then came betrayal, or what Gussie saw as betrayal. The board of directors, alarmed by his behavior, moved to remove him from leadership. The person positioned to benefit was his son, Adolphus Busch III, a palace coup inside a beer empire. The king pushed aside by his heir. Gussie was devastated. He retreated to Grant's Farm like an exiled monarch, wandering the estate that had once been his theater, now surrounded by ghosts of the life he could not keep. And it was not only grief and corporate politics that haunted the big house. Something darker had already happened there, a moment that showed how privilege can bend justice, how money can turn a tragedy into a footnote. In 1976, Gussie and Trudy's son Peter was in the big house with his friend David Lear. A loaded revolver, a moment of reckless handling, a gunshot that ended a young life instantly. Peter claimed the gun discharged when he tossed it onto the bed. Investigators noted details that made the story feel questionable, but the outcome was what mattered. Peter was charged with manslaughter. He pleaded guilty. He received probation, no jail time. A young man died, and the consequences landed like a feather. David Lear was buried. Peter went on with his life, later receiving a profitable distributorship. And for those who watched from the outside, it was another example of a pattern that would follow the Busch dynasty for decades: death, legal entanglement, and an outcome softened by power. Gussie lived 13 more years after being forced out of the company. He married again, to his secretary Margaret, who became the first woman on the company board. She later died suddenly, leaving him alone again. In 1989, Gussie died at Grant's farm at 90 years old. His will revealed the complexity and bitterness that still existed beneath the polished family image. He left symbolic items, he left instructions about art and possessions, and he left his eldest son, the man who took his company, almost nothing, just a single golden telegram passed down through generations. Even in death, Gussie sent a message: "You took my throne, but you did not get my blessing." After Gussie, the big house became less of a home and more of a symbol, used for gatherings, events, a quiet monument to a dynasty that had peaked and was beginning to fracture. The family story did not end, though. It simply shifted into a more modern kind of darkness, the kind built from speed, addiction, and scandal. Gussie's grandson, Adolphus Busch IV, grew up surrounded by the expectation that he would one day lead the empire. He had the looks and charisma people associate with heirs. He also carried recklessness that made him fascinating and dangerous. In 1983, at 20 years old, he left a bar in Tucson with a young woman named Michelle Frederick. He was driving his Corvette fast. At a curve known for accidents, the car flipped. Michelle was thrown out and killed. What made the story truly dark was not only the death, it was what came after. August fled the scene. He did not call for help. He did not report it. He went home. Police later found him injured and disoriented. He claimed amnesia. Investigators found signs of alcohol, empty beer cans. The case dragged on. Lawyers fought evidence collection. Time passed until toxicology meant nothing. In the end, authorities declined charges. Insufficient evidence, they said. And the public watched another young life disappear into the shadow of wealth. 2 years later, August was involved in another incident, a chase with undercover officers, a story that ended with acquittal. Despite everything, he continued rising through the company, shaping marketing campaigns, becoming the heir in practice as well as in name. In 2006, he became chief executive, the last Busch to run the company their ancestor built. And then the ultimate defeat arrived, not in a bedroom, not in a car crash, but in a boardroom. In 2008, InBev moved to purchase Anheuser-Busch for billions. August fought the takeover, but the board, including his own father, accepted. With signatures, more than a century of family ownership ended. The empire that began with an immigrant stepping off a boat passed into foreign hands. The Busch family remained wealthy, but the crown was gone. Then, in 2010, another death touched August's orbit. His girlfriend, Adrienne Martin, was found dead in his bed. Lethal levels of drugs in her system. The death was ruled accidental. Lawsuits followed. Settlements. No criminal charges. Another tragedy. Another set of questions. Another outcome that felt, to outsiders, like the world treated this dynasty differently. And through all of it, Grant's farm remained standing. That is what makes this mansion so strange. It outlasts the men who built it. It absorbs the century like a sponge. It shifts identities without ever losing the weight of what happened inside it. It has been a private palace and a public attraction. It has hosted presidents and tourists. It has heard laughter in ballrooms and gunshots in bedrooms. It has watched fortune surge and watched ownership slip away. Today, visitors still come to Grant's farm. Children still feed baby goats. Tourists still take photos at the Clydesdale stables. The Bavarian courtyard still feels like an imported village. The deer park still holds animals that make people feel like they stepped into a curated world. Nearby, Hardscrabble still stands, the cabin Grant built when he was not yet a legend. That structure is a reminder that history is never as clean as we want it to be. A future president struggled on this land, then lost it in financial ruin. A German immigrant family purchased it and built a castle, then watched their own tragedies unfold under the same sky. In 2017, parts of the family moved to secure the farm's future, keeping it operating, preserving it as an attraction, maintaining it as a place where the public can still touch a piece of American mythology. Meanwhile, the big house remains private, not a permanent residence, but a venue, a symbol, a backdrop for weddings and special events. And that is where the darkness becomes almost absurd. Couples now exchange vows inside rooms built as monuments to empire and marked by death. Guests toast in hallways once haunted by grief. Photographers capture smiles under ceilings that listen to gunshots. The past and present coexist in the same space, separated only by the human ability to forget what a building remembers. If you stand on that land and look up at the mansion, you can feel the pressure of all the stories layered into it. Immigrant ambition, presidential hardship, Prohibition survival, public generosity, private collapse, love and divorce, death by accident, death by gunshot, death by overdose, corporate betrayal, corporate defeat, a dynasty that gave America its most famous beer and one of its most recognizable symbols, the Clydesdales, and also gave America a reminder that wealth does not insulate the human heart, because that is the final truth behind the Grant's Farm Mansion. It was built to prove the Busch family had arrived. It was built to anchor them to American history. It was built as a monument to success, and yet it became, again and again, a stage for the one thing success cannot conquer: suffering. August Anheuser. Busch Sr. did not build that bedroom thinking it would become the place he died by his own hand. Gussie did not reopen those halls thinking they would become a palace full of loss. The heirs who grew up under that roof did not imagine that the same privilege that protected them would also isolate them, pushing them into a world where consequences felt optional and tragedy felt inevitable. The mansion still stands. The gates still open for the public sections. The horses still parade. The tourists still smile. And, somewhere behind the private walls of the big house, in rooms most people will never see, the history remains, not as a tidy narrative but as a long echo, reminding anyone who listens closely that the American dream, when stretched into a dynasty, often comes with a shadow long enough to cover a mansion.